at something that happened, I suppose, all the way back in 2012, but came to light in 2014 when the research was actually made public. And that is the so-called Facebook experiment. Even in calling it that, I am, I suppose, being contentious because one of the responses to the concern and outrage at this is that Facebook is experimenting on people all the time, and not only Facebook. Somebody says, yeah, Google has acknowledged running about 20,000 experiments on its search results every year. Well, I mean, so it may be that concentrating attention on this one particular experiment is wrong, or calling it the Facebook experiment is wrong. And I'm definitely open to that idea. But it also may be that there are certain unique features of this experiment, of this project, that raise particular ethical questions. I don't need to review the facts with you. You know the facts from reading the material. But I think here from this, I'm looking just at some of the newspaper articles that I provided you, that although academic protocols generally call for getting people's consent before psychological research is conducted on them, Facebook didn't ask for explicit permission from those that it's selected for the experiment. It argued that its 1.28 billion, and I'm sure that that's much higher now, monthly users gave blanket consent to the company's research as a condition of using the service. And this raises, of course, the very contentious issue of the whole idea of the terms of service, which is a continuing matter of dispute and disagreement between not only Facebook, but many of our big tech companies, that terms of use, we could go in all sorts of different directions and talk about all sorts of different issues having to do with the terms of use, so-called terms of use agreement. But if we just look at what's there, I think that we are immediately reminded of week one. And I think that week one of this class, our little exploration of Kantianism and utilitarianism is really very relevant here, because the accusation against Facebook is basically that they violated the second categorical imperative. And I think you should see that. Not that they definitely did, but that is a plausible and relevant thing here. The second categorical imperative, that you should always treat persons, as ends in themselves, and never as things. And that means never treating them as a means to an end. Clearly, Facebook did that here. That is, they used its vast usership, or I don't know, customer base, really. They used them, they manipulated them. And the thing about the second categorical imperative is that it probably is not something you can actually follow unless you make some exceptions for consent. For instance, if I start a business and I hire somebody as an employee, I am definitely, in a certain sense, using them as a means to an end. That is, I am employing them. Right? I am using their labor to make a profit. So on the face of it, it would seem that I am violating the second categorical imperative. But if I do that with their consent, if I do it in a non-coercive way, for instance, if I try to enslave somebody, if I try to exploit their labor against their will without their consent, I am clearly violating the second categorical imperative. But if I employ them, use them, exploit their labor with their consent, then it's generally taken, I believe, unless you're a Marxist, which you very much can be, fine with me being a Marxist. I'm very sympathetic to Marx, but Unless you're a Marxist, I think you would say, well, that's different. That is, if you're employed, if you enter into an employment contract with an employer, you are giving your consent, basically, to have your labor exploited. So the issue of whether or not the terms of service actually implied a consent to be a subject of psychological research, what is basically medical research, is a very important issue in this controversy. I mean, I don't know what you think. I mean, I guess that question is an empirical question or a question of law. That is, we would actually have to go through the terms of service. We would have to actually parse it all and ask ourselves whether it actually does imply a consent to be part of something like this research. I don't know how far that would actually get us, but that would be the only way to really seriously address that question. I think that there's a huge amount of skepticism about that. That is on Facebook's part, that it, in good faith, really believes that its terms of service clearly or in any reasonable way also imply a consent to be subjects of scientific studies, psychological research. I guess that's that's an open question. So Kant is definitely in play here. Kant and respect for persons, respect for rights, not using people as a means but treating them as an end is definitely in play here. But of course, so is utilitarianism. One of the things I think that we need to acknowledge about things like Facebook, about the internet in general, is that it is unprecedented in many ways. And that's simply a fact. There's never been a company like Facebook before the 21st century. There simply hasn't. It's not even clear what kind of company Facebook really is. But because it's so new, because there's nothing like a company that actually is an aggregator of people's lives, that has literally billions of users who are all leaving their traces, whose information is freely available to the company. There's never been anything like that. If we compare it to an old-fashioned newspaper, print newspaper before the advent of the internet, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer had many, many readers, but there was no way for the New York Times to do something like what Facebook did, to do the kind of research on how their product was being used and what the effect of their product was on its users. The New York Times would print hundreds of thousands of copies of its daily newspaper and send it out into the world. But it had no way of studying how that newspaper, the copies of that newspaper, how it was actually being used, how it was being read by the readership. An entirely new situation exists for companies like Facebook to actually look at the effect of their product, and of course it is a product, on its consumers, on its users. And it does that, or at least, I don't know, today, after all this heat, whether it still does it in terms of scholarly research. But Facebook apparently at least had a policy of partnering with academics to actually do legit academic research on its users, on Facebook itself. That provides, as this piece here, A Bright Side to Facebook's Experiments on its Users, says, studying how we use social media may provide important insights into some of the deepest mysteries of human behavior. That is, the kind of experiments that Facebook was doing, again, partnering with legit academics, may actually have a real important function. I mean, it may have really beneficial results into not only better understanding people's use of social media and really remembering the topic, which is a very interesting topic of this paper, which is the idea of social contagion, the idea that emotions may be passed on through social media. That reading more negative posts may make you feel more negative, and reading more positive posts may make you feel more positive. I don't know. And that you may reflect this in what you say and do is a very interesting topic. And some of the response has been to say that it would be a shame if Facebook were to feel, for legal or public relation reasons, that it could no longer do this, because it's an important research opportunity for science and for society, right? I found this especially interesting because, remembering that this is an issue that is several years old right now, and it, of course, took place before the election of Donald Trump and before the Russian interference in American elections in 2016. So I found this part of this article especially interesting, where there is reference to another Facebook experiment during the 2010 elections, in which, so let's say, another experiment, Facebook randomly divided 61 million American users into three camps on election day in 2010 and showed each group a different nonpartisan get out the vote message or no message. The results showed that certain messages significantly increased the tendency of people to vote. Now, that's very interesting, right? And, in a certain respect, one may say completely unobjectionable for Facebook to do, maybe not, but I guess getting people to vote in a nonpartisan way, I can't see that as being objectionable. But as this professor from University of North Carolina said, it points out that many of these studies serve to highlight Facebook's awesome power over our lives. Quote, I read that and I said, wait, Facebook controls elections? If they can nudge us all to vote, they could nudge some of us individually. And we know they can model whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, and elections are decided by a couple of 100,000 voters in a handful of states. So the kind of nudging power they have is real power. Well, that's really, looking back from 6 years later, or 10 years later, that's just incredible, because that's exactly what happened in the 2016 elections. The Russians had a sophisticated understanding of social media and were able to, perhaps, some would say, clearly influence the election, if not be responsible for the election of Donald Trump. So, their favorite candidate, that's all I'm saying. I mean, of course, the Russians favored Trump in 2016. It's obvious, but I'm not even saying that's a bad thing, although, of course, it is a bad thing, but that's not even important. The importance is sort of, wow, I mean, that some people are saying, well, what the real importance of this experiment is not about the ethical issues involved in performing psychological experiments on people without their consent. It's about highlighting just how powerful social media is. If the social media can affect your psychological mood, well, it can also affect the way you vote. And if that is true, then maybe social media is just way too powerful. I mean, in the sense that it reaches so many people, and that's what I was saying at the beginning of this, is that we've never really had a situation like that before. Opinion makers, social influencers. In the old days, they were newspapers, magazines, and, of course, also television. But I don't think that we've ever really faced a situation like the power of a company like Facebook to potentially influence political, social opinions, psychological mood. It's definitely, and it's something we will revisit later in the semester when we look specifically at social media in a perhaps more radical, broader context in the ideas of intervalence and the effect of the use of social media on our happiness and things like that. So I don't have that much more to say really about this. I think that we should just take a look at the readings. There are some people who think that it's blown out of proportion and that it misses the point. And I've been drawing on that this post here, this article. What does the Facebook experiment teach us? Which I think is very interesting in that it does say that we're missing the point here. But also this last reading really condemning the experiment as being potentially harmful to people. I mean, and again, that would bring us back to basics, to things like this, really in a Kantian way, showing a deep disrespect for people. And that may be a problem with the company itself, Facebook, is that doesn't really have a record, a history of respecting its users as respecting their rights as people. But it goes to the root issue that just performing an experiment without telling people that they're subject to that experiment, which is meant to gauge effects on their mood, it may be a very dangerous thing, and it may show just a deep disregard for those users of Facebook who are also, of course, people.